ready to go. Okay, good. Okay. Okay, hello, well, late morning, almost afternoon, and welcome to the Word Festival, and in particular, our wonderful reading today by Maureen Mayhew. So I'm just going to start things off with a little bit of information about where we are, our sponsors, and an intro to Maureen. Yeah, so it's wonderful to see you all. And I would like to acknowledge that the festival takes place on the unceded homelands of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. I've traveled over from Vancouver Island, where I live, on the traditional territories of the Cowichan tribes in Malahat Nation. And I'm really trying to learn to give, a land acknowledgement that feels, closer to the hearts. And my goal is to be able to give one in the language of the Cowichan peoples, which is Hulkaminam. And I'm working on it. I'm not quite there yet. But just to let you know that we don't just say this, it's really heartfelt and a consideration, reflection on how we're walking that path of reconciliation. So, yeah. All right. So I would like to thank the sponsors because, of course, this festival and a festival of this size and complexity couldn't happen without support. And in particular, from the Canada Arts Council, the Canada Heritage Fund, BC Gaming, Creative BC, the City of Vancouver, DBVIA, the Hamber Foundation, the Joseph Wask Foundation, the Asian Canadian Writers Workshop, CWIL, Pace and Associates, the Federation of BC Writers, the League of Canadian Poets, the Writers Union of Canada, and there is a complete list on the Word website. Yeah, and I didn't say my name, I'm Leanne Boschman. So hello to all of you. And now I get to introduce our author for this session, Maureen Mayhew. Maureen earned a medical degree from McGill University, then spent a decade interlacing treks to remote corners of the world with a rural medical practice across Canada. In 2000, she accepted an offer to work in Afghanistan with Médecins Sans Frontières. That decision changed her life and motivated her to return to the country many times over the ensuing years. Wanting to better address the health challenges she had witnessed in Afghanistan, she completed a Master in Public Health degree at Johns Hopkins University, and a fellowship in mixed methods research at the University of British Columbia. Her work has been published in peer-reviewed scientific journals and portrayed in 2 educational films. Enamored by her experience in Afghanistan, she wrote articles sharing what she learned in the Canadian Medical Association Journal and contributed to the book Outside the Wire, The War in Afghanistan in the Words of Its Participants. As a clinical professor in the School of Population and Public Health at UBC, she has instructed students on topics in global health, refugee health, program evaluation, and remote primary health care. Currently, she works in the BC Physician Health Program, where she helps doctors and trainees face challenges related to mental health, relationships, high-pressure work situations, and career and life transitions. She has a private life and leadership coaching practice that aims to help doctors thrive and reach their full potential. And her book is Hand on My Heart. There it is. Beautiful photography, which you're going to be now treated to more of. And I just wanted to say how memoir is it's really an interesting genre. And this quotation came to mind. It's from the author Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie. And I think she kind of nails something here about memoir. She says nonfiction, and in particular, the literary memoir, the stylized recollection of personal experience, is often as much about character and story and emotion as fiction is. And I just want to say that I think that the character, the story, the emotion are extremely compelling, and we're really honored to welcome you here today, Maureen.
Thank you, Leanne. I'm so happy that you enjoyed the book as you described it. And thanks so much to Word Vancouver for inviting me to speak, and for you in the audience online as well as in the room for coming. And I hope that the presentation will give you a little bit of an idea of what I experienced in Afghanistan and what I learned.
Sorry, a quick question. Are you all right with audience members taking photos?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. So each time I went to Afghanistan, there was something inside me that sort of grew and awakened, and I wasn't really sure what it was, but that's the reason I wrote the book, is I wanted to understand what was this thing that was growing inside me that I couldn't really name. And so I hope that this talk gives you a little bit of an idea about that. Next slide. I took this photograph in 2007, and it's evocative, right? And if I had seen this photograph prior to 2000, when I first went to Afghanistan, I went there a total of 8 times. If I had seen this photograph prior to my going there, then it would have sparked kind of frustration, maybe anger, a lot of judgment in me. And so I ask you, what does that photograph inspire in you? And one of the things that we think about in this world of ours is how connected we're all supposed to be, yet how judgy we all often are. And I thought of myself as really open-minded, and yet I judged this without knowing the context. This is me. Oh, next slide. Oops, sorry. This is me. Right? I love freedom. I love being in the outdoors. I love no rules. I love. You heard my educational history. There's a lot of it there, so I love to learn, and I'm independent. And at the time, unmarried and no kids. And next slide. What I thought about Afghanistan was that women were stuck in compounds and they were kind of second-class citizens, next slide, with no rights and no respect. And I got that information and came to that conclusion using Western sources of information, because that's what was available to me in 2000, right? Never occurred to me to look at any other sources, because the Western sources were impartial and correct. Yeah, right. Somebody's laughing. And what changed my mind and caused me to go to Afghanistan was a conversation I had on a satellite phone, a massive delay, with a Dutch woman who was working in Herat at the time. And she said, it's not going to be like that. It's going to be different. You should come and experience these various things that she said. So we'll get into what those were. So, next slide. I'm just going to read to you from chapter 2. Which is entitled My Neverland. In early April 2000, a King Air turboprop propelled us west of Peshawar, Pakistan. Through the scratched window of a porthole, I stared far below at the reddish-brown landscape of Afghanistan, a lifeless desert with deep parallel fissures that resembled wounds from a knife blade. Squinting, I searched the ground for armored vehicles and tanks, even snipers. Of course, I didn't see any. True to his word, the pilot flew high, supposedly out of range of whatever weapons the Taliban possessed. To anyone on the ground, our plane would appear as a tiny speck speeding across a vast blue sky. The Civil War awaited, and as a first-timer, I was sweating. Traveling alone, I knew nothing about the other passengers, the 6 men who dressed in Central Asian garb, and the one Caucasian female in a shalwar kameez like me. In Herat, someone bearing a sign that featured the world-renowned logo of Médecins Sans Frontières, MSF, would meet me in the airport parking lot. Getting a seat on the plane had been a crapshoot, even when I possessed a ticket. In 2000, only the International Committee of the Red Cross flew into Afghanistan. It had taken 5 days of negotiations to get a seat on the aircraft, which had me wondering whether MSF ranked rock bottom in some obscure but important hierarchy. Once I was summoned to the office only to wait for 2 hours before being told that they had canceled the flight with no explanation. Our staff told me that the unpredictable schedule was a safety tactic. Although annoying for passengers, it kept their pilots alive. Maybe tomorrow. The agent's voice had sounded tired, but for some reason, I hung on to the hope that I heard in it. The next morning, the ticket agent weighed each passenger along with their carry-on bags and luggage. Not a kilogram beyond the 20 kilos per person limit was permissible, because the plane had to carry enough fuel in jerry cans for the return trip. Apparently, the Taliban stole petrol. I had left every stitch of Western clothing behind in a box labeled with my name and return date at the MSF guest house in Peshawar. For 9 months, I would wear my 3 new shalwar kameezes with matching chadors that the organization had purchased for me. Dressed in my new garb, I felt lighter somehow, as if my costume gave me freedom to explore forgotten remnants of myself. Heading into Afghanistan, I felt like a neophyte actress without a script who was about to step on stage to perform in a play, only the plot was still a mystery. All right, next slide. So this slide is not the Herat airport where I landed that first time, because I couldn't take a photograph of the airport. Then it was illegal to do so, and I would have lost my camera. I would have been confiscated. But imagine yourself in that little plane, and the plane is just landing on this tarmac, and on the right hand side you see a plane that's lying. It no longer has wheels on it. It's a passenger plane, and it's been there for a while. And on the left-hand side, you see 2 helicopter gunships that are no longer functional, and then some military paraphernalia strewn about. And then, again, in that plane, we're heading towards about 50 men, and they're all over there between you and the airport. And they all are wearing these big turbans, and they're in shalwar kameez, and they have beards that are 2 fists long, because that's the way it had to be during the Taliban regime in 2000. And their faces are really stern, and they look like they just came out of the Bible. And as you step down from the plane, a pathway opens up between the men that leads to the airport that has bullet holes in it. And but nobody looks at you and nobody acknowledges your existence, and you feel like a ghost. That's my first experience of Afghanistan. And I realized in that moment I was in this time warp. Like, I was thinking I was in a time warp. And like, how do you relate to biblical times? And is that really the right thing to think about? There was no playbook for me at that point, and I knew I had to make it up. Next slide. So I have a little quiz for you. I want you to pick out the Taliban. I'm going to show you 6 photographs. So number 1, next. Number 2, next. Number 3, and number 4. Next. Number 5. Next. Number 6. Anyone?
4.
Next one. Number 2 and number 5.
Number 2.
Yeah.
Too sweet.
Isn't he sweet? It's like he was the PVPV police guy. So, and he insisted that I take his photograph, which was illegal for me to do at the time. And he would have been the guy who would confiscate my camera and destroy the film. But he wanted me to take a picture. And PVPV stands for, let me get this right, the promotion of virtue and the prevention of vice. Those are the cops. Now, the guy on the in the color photograph, he was jumping over a canal for the first time. His foot's been blown off. I can't remember how, but he was a Taliban soldier. And we met him we were walking in the evening, and this bunch of villagers started following us, and he wanted to know who I was and what I thought and all these different things. And so the one thing to think about is when war is one of the few occupations, like soldiering is one of the few occupations in a place, they don't care which side they fight on. He wasn't a Taliban from the standpoint of believing in the Taliban. They paid him money, and that was important. So this here is a picture of Balamurgab, which is the town it's a village. And it's a mud village. You can see it's all the same color, pretty much. It's all made of mud, except for this building here, which was the clinic, and this building here, which is a munitions warehouse. And the Taliban had put all the unexploded ordnance in the warehouse, which you think, well, that's a dumb place to put that, because what if it goes up, right? It destroys the whole village. But it took us 2 days to get to Balamurgab. Driving, it was 180 kilometers, 2 days to drive that. Next slide. And this is a close-up of some of the mud houses, and there was no running water. They were very thick walled. There was no electricity. The thick walls were great, and the dome ceilings were great for keeping the heat in the winter and the heat out in the summer. And there was no internet. There were no television stations. There was no phone system. There was no cell phone system. So we were really cut off from the rest of the world. Next slide. And this might remind you of something. This is a woman and her maharam, which is a male family member who escorts her from A to B when she's outside the compound, and she's on her way to the clinic. Next slide. This is a picture of a man, and it's on the front of the cover. And you might think, oh, geez, those guys are really poor, right? But in fact, the guy with the horse and the cart is actually, he's pretty wealthy because he's got a means to support himself and his family. And the guy walking behind him, oh, that's okay. He's just got boots on and he doesn't have a horse and cart, so he's less fortunate. And the people who have bare feet and no shoes are the poorest. Go ahead. and this here is how people harvested wheat. So they did it manually, making this big pile of straw with the grain, and then they would go round and round and round with a cart with a bunch of stones on it to crush it, and then they would use the wind to separate the wheat from the chaff. Next slide. This lady is sitting in the waiting room of the clinic, and and one of the things that really attracted me to working in Afghanistan, and that caused me to go back there again and again, was the creativity that it was involved in trying to make these ideas that I had palatable in the culture that I was working in. So even things like family planning, like how do you introduce the idea of not having a baby when you have sex, to very religious people and people who make those kinds of decisions through family discourse. And so you actually had to have the families okay for the women to have whatever it was. Now, it's true that there were some women who came to us in secret, and we'd stick an IUD in them, and then cut the strings really short so nobody would know. But that was by far the minority. Next slide. This is the back side of the clinic, and we hadn't refurbished the whole of the clinic because it had been a hospital, and now we were just doing outpatients. So we left the backside unfinished, and we didn't use it until we had a problem with malnutrition, and we needed to expand our programs. And so this was us beginning to use this and then refurbishing it later. And what I wanted to bring your attention to is over here, the blue writing indicates that the area has been demined. Afghanistan is one of the, has a lot of mines in the country, and so before you do anything, you make sure that the mines and the unexploded ordnance have been removed. Next slide. Now I'm concealing everybody's name. I've changed everybody's name in the book because a lot of people are still living in Afghanistan. And I'm not showing the true picture of the individual that I'm speaking about, whose name is Kareem in the book. Now, Kareem and I are very unlikely friends, but we did become friends over a period of time. And what drew us together was learning Dari, me wanting to learn Dari, one of the languages, and him wanting to learn English. Now, he didn't speak any English, and I didn't speak any Dari, and we only had a Persian dictionary to try and help us figure all this stuff out. So his background is he was married, he's 27, married 3 times, had 2 living wives, 5 sons, and had stopped going to school at the age of 8, and was forced to marry at the age of 14 by his dad. And he was very religious. And I already told you what I was like. So it was really an unlikely combination, but we sat side by side creating our own little dictionaries from the conversation every single night until I left. And I lost contact with him because there's no telephones, no et cetera, until very recently when I found out he had a cell phone. And it was like, oh, maybe I can text him. So I texted him. And I said, so how many sons do you have? And he goes, 15. and I got 3 daughters too now. And I asked him how many wives he had, and he didn't answer that one. Next slide. So it did take him 6 months to invite me to his house. And in a place like Afghanistan, where I was invited to everyone's house all the time, the first time I met them, that was an anomaly. So now I'm going to read you a short excerpt from chapter 11. and this was, I had entered the house, and I'd met him and one of his sons. A powerful hand on my elbow gently steered me toward the door of a room at the opposite end of the compound from the hallway where the young woman had vanished. Looking down, I noticed a wizened face near my shoulder. A white chaudhry printed with tiny blue and purple flowers cascaded over her head and ended at her ankles. Women in Balamorgab use the term chaudhry for two types of coverings: a thin chador-like robe when at home, and a thick, heavily embroidered garment like a medieval mantle for going outside. When necessary, the face could be hidden by wrapping the two front edges around the head. The woman's body curved forward like a parenthesis, probably a result of osteoporosis. Using Kareem's age, I calculated how old this matriarch must have been. We were a similar age, and yet she looked 2 decades my senior. Although her life had been infinitely more difficult than mine, her gray eyes beamed a warm welcome. This tiny woman seemed fortified in some way. I instantly liked her. At the same time, I felt lucky. Bio, chai boho. Her calloused hand grasped mine. Together we walked through the sun-dappled shade beneath the mulberry tree toward the guest room doorway. My mother, Dr. Maureen. Kareem mumbled self-consciously, his pride mixed with boyhood self-consciousness. I imagined the intensity of their discussion about whether he should invite me into their home. Was her vote the reason why his invitation had taken so long? Glancing over my shoulder toward the archway on the far side of the courtyard, I saw 2 young women standing side by side and whispering, each one bouncing a baby in her arms. A 2-year-old and a 4-year-old hid amid the folds of their mother's skirts, peeking out to smile coyly before quickly ducking behind the drapery. My first impression of Kareem's wives was that they were healthy and of a similar age. The one who had been stirring the pot was bigger and looked jovial. Kalikashat Konant, Kareem said with a smile. I loved that phrase, which meant they peak. In Balamorgab, where so many activities were forbidden, we all peaked. And there is a whole chapter about peaking in the book. Next slide, please. So learning the language was a ticket of entry for me to really go into houses, meet women, and really experience what it was like to be in families in Afghanistan. And I sort of viewed it as a way of entering what I thought of as a silo of Afghan culture, that's because it was so distinct from Western culture. And I approached it with curiosity, and I avoided judgment. And I was very conscious of that. And that was very necessary for me in order to have the experiences that I had. Next slide. So what in my book, I invite you to join me on these little adventures. There's many adventures from the comfort of your own living. Next slide. And, you know, I didn't fit in with the gender roles that existed in Afghanistan. Question 1, whenever I went to a wedding or a tea party or a family event, how many children do you have? None. And question 2, where's your husband? Didn't have one of those either. So I failed twice, and they felt sorry for me. And I looked at them and I thought, geez, you gotta get married, and geez, you gotta have children, and you gotta bake all the bread and all this stuff, and I felt sorry for them. And that was the dynamic. But we were still curious about each other. Next slide. So in fast forward, 2001, 9/11 you all know of, and I decided that I didn't like the news I thought it was lopsided in the coverage, and so I went back there in December 2001. And this is a picture of a bunch of tanks that Ismail Khan had, and I got in trouble for taking it. And one of the most important things, now we know that Taliban have come back, and all the laws are almost identical to the Taliban laws that I experienced in 2000. So they very quickly regressed over that 20-year period of time. And one of the things that's really important is that we be able to work with them, because if we don't, all the women, the educated women, will leave. And then we're back to exactly what we experienced in 2000, which at the time it was a 5% literacy rate for women in rural parts of the country. And I had no female translators. That's the other reason for me learning the language. And there's a little funny story about trying to work with the Taliban. So one day we would often go to the Taliban, and the commander and the governor of the town, and we would say we were building rapport with them. One time we decided to invite them for lunch to our compound, and then when they came, we thought there were two expat women and one expat man. Well, we didn't even know as expat women could we even eat in our own home with these guys. But it turned out we could. And then my next question was, well, I knew enough Dari to actually converse with these guys who were high-level guys, but I didn't know if I should. And so I thought, okay, well, I'm going to try. And I picked a topic that was easy, which was fishing. And so I spoke to my plate, didn't look at them, not supposed to look at them, and I waited. And then he spoke to his plate, and I know because I peeked. And he said, went on about that. And then I spoke to my plate, he spoke to his plate. And that's the way the conversation happened. And that's how we could make it work. We could actually converse in a place that had some really weird gender dynamics. Next slide. So one of the most fun times that I had in Afghanistan was going out in the early evening during the golden hour of photography, because I love photography. And I would meet people, and they loved to talk to me because they could talk directly to me, no interpreter. And interpreters are great, and they're skilled, and they color the conversation between two people because they have a lot of power. Next slide. This slide was taken in 2006. I met these girls, and they had the opportunity to go to school, but they didn't go to school because they had to get the water for the household. And it took them 3 hours every day to get the water for the household. So literacy is not only about having schools, it's also about having water and things like that, and people believing that literacy is important. But it's hard when you're a survivalist. Next slide. This is MSF driving up, that's our team, during 2002, driving up a canyon to get to remote parts of the country so that we could build some clinics up there. And next slide. And here we're discussing with each clinic that we wanted to build, we had to get the village to donate land, or someone in the village to donate land to the village, so that the clinic, when we left it, would belong to the village and not the individual, the wealthy man with the money. Next slide. We made tent clinics at first because we didn't have the materials to build the clinics, and we couldn't use sun-dried bricks. And this is a girl. Behind her is her maharam, her brother. Next slide. And another tricky thing in Afghanistan is travel. we had a map that showed we're going very remote. We had a map that showed we could go down the hill. There was a road down the hill, across, and a bridge across the river, and then we could take the road on the other side and get to the village. Well, when we came to the top of the hill, the road was being built, even though it existed on the map. Next slide. And this was the bridge, which obviously you don't take a car across that. So we walked across that and we left the car. Next slide. And then we rented horses. And that's how we got to where we needed to go. Next slide. And this is just a scenery slide of the canyon that we went up. Next slide. These here, in that area were a lot of nomads, who we call Kuchi, and they are pastoralists who move from pasture land to pasture land. Next slide. And they live with their animals, and this is inside the goat hair tent, which is created by hand by the women and then handed down generation to generation. And the blankets there is the barrier inside the tent between where the baby animals sleep and where the humans sleep. Next slide. We bathed in the river by swimming because there were no showers. And this picture with the man and the hollyhocks and the MSF car, he was waiting for us the whole day in the shade of one tree while we did a 9-hour trek to 7 villages to see whether or not the villages were dying from tuberculosis. Next slide. But Afghans love to laugh. And this is the lesson given to a foreigner on the back and the Afghan, by the Afghan on the front, about how to ride a camel bareback. We were really pathetic, and I kept falling off, and so that's why they decided to do it, to teach us in that way. Next slide. So I ask you, and this is a little bit of a comparison, rural to urban, because I did spend several years in Kabul area as well. So these little girls are villagers, and I ask you, given what they have, the resources, the mentors, what they see, their experience, who will they become? And next slide. And this, really, they have moms and wives for the most part, as mentors, right? And so that's what they see, and that's who they become. And this lady has that number of children, and she was married to one of our healthcare workers, and she appeared really meek and mild when I first met her. Next slide. But at one point when we were talking, she turned to her husband and she grabbed his turban and stuck it on her head, and then she said to me, "Take my picture." And so I did, and we had a real good laugh about that. Next slide. So this is a picture of a man in Kabul. He was one of my drivers, and his daughter. So you can see very different sort of sense. I spent 2005 to 2009 in Kabul. You can ask, who will she become? And her mentors, next slide, are going to be people like these. These ladies I worked with in the government for most of that period of time. Next slide. Or these ladies who are midwives, and they're teaching upcoming midwives in a whole bunch of different schools that we set up. Next slide. So what I sort of thought of myself as a planter of seeds. Like I can plant a seed in a rural girl's mind about what's possible, and at least that was something. And I could plant a seed in her father's mind too, even if it's just showing him what's possible. Next slide. So each time I went to Afghanistan, or each time I left, I guess we threw a party. Each time I arrived, we didn't throw a party, but you know, you can see there's sort of camaraderie and a positive vibe there. Next slide. And so what I think I ended up uh, experiencing in Afghanistan was a kind of camaraderie, a kind of brotherliness, a sisterliness that I had no idea. And there was something about trust and dependability um, that that was important to me in my experiences in Afghanistan. And this man was our traveling cook, and he was also our cleaner. Next slide. So I hope you enjoyed the talk, and if you want to know more, well, there's a book. So thank you.
Thank you, Maureen. And we do have time for some questions from the audience. I will just get things started, and also let you know with audience questions that I'll repeat them for the sake of our audience. And I just have a brief question, and it's really clear from these stunning photographs that you were processing and capturing and engaging with the world in that very visual, vivid way. What about the writing side? Because you now have this wonderful book, your memoir. What did the writing? What was that process like when you went to Afghanistan and as the years rolled out? And did you keep notes, journals, etc.?
Yeah, so because it was such a different world that I found myself in, I needed to write to process it. So I was doing several things. I was journaling. I was also writing letters home because we didn't have any internet. We had a tiny bit of internet once a day. We could download stuff, but it had to be small because it was expensive. So letters, journaling, and then photography, and there was a lot of that, and that's really how I the raw materials that I used. And then in 2008, I started writing. And so I had all of these ideas and vignettes and notes and schematics about what I might do. And then I left it. And so it was a kind of coming and going back and forth over that period of time. But I got serious about writing it in about 2017.
I'm curious where you live, especially in Herat.
Where I lived in Herat.
Yes.
Yeah.
The question is, where did you live in Herat?
So, gosh, in Herat, I didn't spend much time in Herat. I lived in Herat in the central area near the hospital, and I can't remember the exact street, in an MSF compound that first time. Later on, I lived in UN compounds in different places. But I can't remember the details of like the exact addresses or things like that.
So did you have guards and people around those areas where you slept and lived?
Yeah, we had unarmed guards in the MSF compounds in all of the places that we lived, because that's a thing for MSF. And then in the UN compounds they had armed guards. And one time I lived in a hotel, and that was a bad idea, and wasn't my idea. That was in Herat, and the army was in there too, and the doors didn't lock, so that was a bit scary. Yeah.
So you said you were planting a lot of seeds there in both male and female minds. But at the same time, we can see the trajectory of what's happened in Afghanistan. What do you see as being the way forward? I mean, these seeds may not grow, probably will not grow. So what do you see as the way forward?
So the question is, what do you see as the way forward? Considering that some of the seeds that seem to have been planted may not grow.
Well, I like to pull back the lens and do a wide angle shot. And so what I would say is the seeds did germinate in many people, but not all people. And when the Taliban took over, then there was this regression. So I don't think that I could ever convince the Taliban, the people who believe in the Taliban rules, etc. I wasn't able to convince any of them. I don't think. I would have only convinced people who were on the border of not belonging to them, if that, right? But the other people, I know that some of them did send their girls to school, and I think that's really important. And I know that if you look at the literacy rate in Afghanistan for women, that also has increased a huge amount. So has maternal mortality has decreased, child mortality has decreased a huge amount. But now that we have the Taliban coming back with all their rules, it's going to go backwards. It has to. And so then the question is, what do I see going forward? And I see that this Taliban regime has to play itself out somehow, and the foreign aid groups are not going to be able to change their mind. They're going to be able to stabilize things for some of the people, and eventually the politics have to shift. And to me, that's we have to wait for that, and I don't have a crystal ball for that.
So I'm curious, what's your take on it? For me, I maybe went in the work that I've been doing for 15 years, thinking I had seeds to plant. And I'm very clear, it's actually not what the Western world needs now. I need the seeds that the Malawians have planted here. And I think for me, if I have any faith in the future, it's that those seeds get planted here. And we drop our mill of what we think they need. So I'm wondering, when you look at all the wisdom, even some words of wisdom from the women, what did you feel were planted in you, and what do you miss? Because they probably don't exist in here. And how do you cultivate that here? It's kind of a deep question, but it's curious.
So if I
So-
pair,
Oh, are you gonna
I'm gonna
paraphrase the
try.
question? Yeah, go.
and you can tell me if I get it right. So the question is, there's the idea of planting seeds in others, in Afghans, but the question really is, what seeds did Afghans plant in me that I can then germinate here?
Yeah, sort of, yes, and the other part is what you miss.
And what I miss,
Mm-hmm.
what I miss about Afghanistan. I think the one of the biggest seeds that was planted in me was the seed of family and the meaning of family and the absolute trust. It was like, that's a guaranteed support. And that was not my experience. I came from a nomadic background. And so I never thought of family as that. And so, you could say, well, that's kind of weird. Like, lots of people have that here. Why did you need to go over there to get that? But there, it's just that much more tangible. and it's a survivalist kind of culture in the rural parts, and so you know the idea that you could, in banding together, and it was actually more broad than that. It's really community, but for them it's family, and a term that's used there called home, which is extended family or clan. um, and there's power in the togetherness, and and we can do many things and become many things if we work together. And again, that's not rocket science, right? But it took me going over there to really understand that concept. And so I think that would be the biggest one. But I think the other thing was the I had all these judgments about, well, they have to have kids and they have to do all this stuff, right? Well, but there's there's a role there, and a lot of women were really proud of what they were doing, right? So my thoughts for me are not necessarily right for anybody else, right? Uh, so so what was really, again, I think it boils down to connection, togetherness, community, family, um, where the where everybody plays a part and everybody kind of plays to their strengths, if you want to call it that, or to their offerings. And and one of the things that I think is really important is that it's not all negative over there. And and that's oftentimes we think of our women's rights as the framework we want to focus on, but it's not only about women's rights, and maybe it's not about women's rights right now. It's about people surviving and people working together to make things better. And yeah, they have a lot of um, barriers to get through when the Taliban are implementing all these rules to keep things the same as historic sameness. Um, but uh, I also think that there's, just like in any place, when the government is saying this, there are people who are going over there and doing something different, and they're really doing something that they believe in. But we're not going to hear about that over here because it has to be a secret. Because if it's not a secret, it can't exist. Um, so I don't know if I answered the question.
Yes, yeah, yeah. Um, did you get one woman who gave you some? I'd love to hear. There was one wise with a woman who gave you just like something that just cut through you and saw something.
The one wise, the wisest woman I met was, let me just think. There's a there's an international woman who comes to mind as the wise woman, and she had lived by that time since 1960 in Afghanistan and Pakistan, and um, and the wisdom that she gave me was, um, accept uh, the the people that I would meet during the Taliban regime the very first time, um, are accept them as they are and accept the offering that they give you because it's right for them. And your problem, me, is going to be all the interpretation you throw on it. And that's what sustained me was was not putting my interpretation on it. And that sort of carried on with a lot of the women
Well, I'd like to know what that woman was doing there and where she came from.
She's English.
Oh.
She's quite the character.
Did she have a job there?
Yes, she was married to an anthropologist,
Oh.
and she had her own business. I think.
So we took one.
Was there one more question?
You go back to Afghanistan to work for what you have done, and is there any magic route to ask to call you back? Because I know some people. There's a girl from Japan. She went to the police place as a volunteer, and every time after doing the volunteers, every time there's something happen in the world, there's some volunteers to protest so many some people there. She just go there, and she met many people like her. She called it the magic fruit. When she found that, oh, there's a calling, I've got to go there. She just go there, and she has many. She has got some depression as well, because there's some people in her country say, oh, you shouldn't go there. You are blah 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 blah, and many hostile letters and she has suffered a lot, but she still wants to go there to be a volunteer. Now she's a volunteer somewhere and like Korea or somewhere, and she wants to be, and she adopt many orphans. Yeah, and we opened a place, a school for the orphans to live and something like that.
Oh.
Yeah, so she said, oh, there's a magic fruit. Something.
A magic fluid?
Yeah.
Okay.
Magic fluid.
Wow.
But you haven't got that.
The magic fluid. So the question is, have I experienced the magic fluid of feeling like I have a calling to do aid work, and will I go back and keep going back? And then there was a story about someone else from Japan who has done exactly that, and I would say is a better woman than I am, because she's still going back, but she's suffering with depression and things like that. And I decided so there were a few things that happened, not to me, but to other people I know. There were some murders that happened to friends of mine, and I decided after that the risk was a little bit high at that time. And you have to understand that when I went to Afghanistan the first time, it was in 2000. No other foreigner, hardly any other foreigners were there. So we were a very small group of people. And as the international community threw a lot of money at it, and there was lots and lots of aid, then there became a large international community there. And then there was backlash because there was too much international westernization going on. So then there was picking off of and targeting of foreigners, as well as targeting of any Afghan who met with a foreigner and who worked with foreigners. And seeing the evolution of that, I eventually thought, you know what, I've had my 9 lives, and I think I'm not going back there. I might do something different, but I'm not going to go back there. But what I can do is I can hand the torch to other people and foster, give them what I have to offer, and plant seeds like we were talking about. Afghans are not poor, pitiful, Afghans who are so needy. They are survivalists. They know way more than you and I do about surviving, right? So that's what I can offer. Yeah.
That is a wonderful note to leave on, I think. Thank you so much, Maureen. Thank you for everything you shared with us. I feel like very powerfully expanded our worldview and understandings of Afghan, the country, the culture, the challenges, the strengths. and that really timely message of interconnectivity and the strength in that. Thank you very much. And Maureen's book is available out in the corridor there on the book table. And are you available to
Yeah.
chat a bit more
Happy
outside?
to chat,
if
happy
people,
to sign,
okay,
whatever you'd like.
okay, excellent. All
Thanks
right.
very much for coming.